The apartment of this elderly woman became a topic of much debate in the last few months, because this woman had kept it hidden from the public for over 25 years. Privacy is one thing, but when a nauseating smell started to exit her home, neighbors became worried. They devised a plan to enter her home, and what they found inside was heartbreaking. Old woman left no one in apartment for 25 years. When they went inside, they found this. Her name was Eunice, but most in the neighborhood knew her as Miss Eunice. She was a permanent fixture in the community, living in a narrow, 4-story apartment building on the corner of West 21st Street. A neighborhood matriarch in every sense of the word, Eunice was the kind of person who could tell you stories about every family that lived on the block, even those who had moved away years ago. She was a living testament to the history of the community, her memory as rich and detailed as the local archives. Despite being in her late 80s, Eunice was an active woman. You could see her most mornings, rain or shine, tending to her well-loved garden in the small patch of ground beside her building. It was not uncommon to see her chatting with the local store owners or stopping to pet a neighborhood dog. She was kind, gentle, a woman of grace and strength that was evident in the lines of her face and the sparkle in her age-dimmed eyes. Yet, amidst this open life, there was one secret Eunice held close. No one ever saw the inside of her apartment. She lived alone, having never married or had children. Her family, few who remained, lived states away and had not visited the apartment in over 25 years. Anytime someone would broach the topic of her apartment, she would deflect, her usual warmth replaced with a firmness that signaled the conversation was over. Even the apartment's landlord, Mr. Peterson, who lived on the ground floor, was in the dark. He had not been inside Eunice's apartment since she moved in. He had offered several times to fix a leaky faucet or a squeaky door, but Eunice always declined, assuring him she could handle any minor repairs. As the years went on, the mystery of Eunice's apartment grew. The other tenants, while respectful of her privacy, couldn't help but speculate. What could be in there? Was she a hoarder? Did she live in squalor? Or was she hiding something more sinister? The intrigue was as much a part of the apartment building's character as the creaky wooden stairs or the antique mailboxes in the foyer. One day, a new tenant, Mrs. Rodriguez, moved into the building. She was a friendly woman, fond of cooking and often sharing her delicious meals with her neighbors. Eunice and Mrs. Rodriguez quickly became friends, bonding over their shared love of gardening. One evening, as Mrs. Rodriguez returned from work, she noticed a peculiar smell coming from Eunice's apartment. It wasn't the usual smell of her rose-scented perfume or the fresh flowers she always had in her hair. It was a smell she couldn't quite place, a smell that made her feel uneasy. She knocked on Eunice's door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time, but still, silence. Feeling a sense of dread, Mrs. Rodriguez alerted Mr. Peterson, the landlord. Together, they decided to open Eunice's apartment. The smell was getting stronger, and they were worried that something might have happened to her. With a heavy heart, Mr. Peterson unlocked the door, preparing himself for the worst. As the door creaked open, the smell worsened. But they could not open it up further because a chain prevented them from looking inside completely. They did see a mountain of stuff, though, through the small crack in the door opening. Furniture was stacked up almost ceiling high, and the rest was concealed around the corner of her hallway walls. But when they wanted to remove the lock chain by reaching their arms inside, they got stopped harshly. It started with footsteps in the distance, but the steps got faster and faster, until the arm of the poor landlord got grabbed from inside the apartment. It was Mrs. Eunice, and she shouted at them, telling them to go away and leave her alone. Mr. Peterson pulled back his arm, and the door was slammed shut. Stunned and taken aback, they retreated. Mrs. Rodriguez felt a pang of guilt for having invaded Eunice's privacy, but the worry for her friend outweighed it. They could only hope that Eunice was all right, despite the unsettling experience. In the days following the incident, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that Eunice was not tending to her garden. Nor was she attending the Sunday Mass. The peculiar smell lingered, and Mrs. Rodriguez felt her concern deepen. In her desperation, she decided to do something she knew she shouldn't. As a hospital employee, she had access to medical files. It felt like a gross invasion of privacy, but her worry for Eunice won over her ethical dilemma at that time. She found Eunice's file and the emergency contact listed therein. To her surprise, it wasn't a family member but a name she didn't recognize. Summoning her courage, she dialed the number. A young man answered, and she explained the situation, about Eunice, the apartment, and the strange smell. The man sounded worried but wished to remain anonymous. He agreed to meet her in a nearby park that afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez made her way to the park. She chose an empty bench between the trees, her heart pounding as she waited. Minutes turned into half an hour, and she began to wonder if she had been stood up. Just as she was about to leave, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around to see a young man, probably in his mid-20s. His face was a mixture of anxiety and relief, and he introduced himself simply as John. John said that he had known Eunice his entire life. His mother was already friends with her, he did not know how. And way back in the day, she was even allowed into her apartment. My mother, unfortunately, passed away last year. So that's probably why I'm her emergency contact now. John had promised his mother that he would take care of Eunice, but her stubbornness and his studies had put him in a difficult spot. The peculiar smell, as Mrs. Rodriguez described it, worried him, though. So he thanked Mrs. Rodriguez for her concern and out-of-the-box thinking. And he promised to take immediate action with her. They decided to confront Eunice together. John's presence, they hoped, would provide the reassurance Eunice needed to let them in. As they approached the building, the knot in Mrs. Rodriguez's stomach tightened. She only hoped that they were not too late. As they stood at the threshold of Eunice's apartment, uncertainty hung in the air. What lay behind the door was still a mystery, a story yet to be told. Would they find Eunice safe, or would their worst fears be realized? As John reached out to knock on the door, they prepared for the unknown. The story of Miss Eunice, John, and Mrs. Rodriguez was far from over. And whatever lay ahead, they were determined to face it together. So with some hesitation in their step, they started knocking on her door. John raised his hand and knocked on the door. He called out Eunice's name, his voice laced with a mixture of hope and fear. There was no response. They waited, their breath hitching in their chests with every second of silence. John knocked again, louder this time, but still, there was no response. The silence probably meant that she wasn't home. John turned to Mrs. Rodriguez, his eyes reflecting the fear they both felt. They couldn't wait any longer. With the situation escalating, John made a decision. He needed to break into the apartment. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to protest, fearing the consequences, but John knew that there was no other way. They needed to know what was happening inside Eunice's apartment. They walked around the outside of the building, looking around for other options to enter. That's when they spotted an elderly man standing at his kitchen window. His apartment shared a wall with Eunice's. Perhaps he could help. They rushed to the man's apartment and explained the situation. The man, Mr. Bernard, was initially reluctant but finally agreed to assist. John climbed out of Mr. Bernard's kitchen window and began to shimmy across the narrow ledge outside of the building. Mrs. Rodriguez watched him nervously from the ground, praying for his safety. Despite the danger, John was determined to reach Eunice's apartment. His hands trembled as he reached for the open window from her apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he made it. With a sigh of relief, John pulled himself through the window and landed inside Eunice's apartment. The smell was stronger here, a sickly sweet odor that made him gag. But he pushed down his revulsion and stepped further into the apartment. It was time to find out what was happening. When John entered the apartment safely, Mrs. Rodriguez rushed upstairs. She waited by the door eagerly and nervously until John was ready to open the door from the inside. He already knew what was hidden inside, and knew the depths of this mystery. But I'm still very much in the dark. What could he have found in there? Mrs. Rodriguez asked herself. Nervously, she moved her fingers as she waited. And then the door slowly opened up. The door creaked and cracked, but when it was fully opened, Mrs. Rodriguez saw her accomplice John standing in the opening. He invited her in with a serious look on his face. She stepped inside and was ready to discover everything with John. Eunice's apartment was a sight to behold. It was like stepping into a different world. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled to the brim. Pictures and mementos from a time long past were scattered everywhere. The furniture was antique and well-maintained, a testament to Eunice's appreciation for the old-world charm. But amidst the clutter, there was a sense of organization. The apartment was eerily silent. As John moved deeper, he called out Eunice's name again. But the only response he received was his echo bouncing off the cluttered walls. The further they went, the stronger the smell became. And then they saw it. A door, slightly ajar, from where the smell seemed to be emanating. The layout of these apartments were all the same, so Mrs. Rodriguez knew that there was a small 10 by 10-foot room behind it. Just like it was in her home. But just before opening, they heard a sound behind them. They both turned around, their hearts pounding in their chests. There, standing in the entrance, was Eunice. Her eyes, usually filled with kindness, were wide with fear and anger. A bag of groceries lay at her feet, the items scattered across the floor. Her voice echoed around the apartment. "What are you doing in my house?" she shouted, looking at them with a mixture of confusion and anger. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward. Her voice was shaky, but she managed to find the words. She explained that they were worried about her. That the smell from her apartment had become unbearable. She told her about John and how he had agreed to help. Eunice's eyes softened at the sight of John. She rushed towards him, her arms wrapping around him in a tight hug. "It's so good seeing you again, my boy," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Wiping away tears, Eunice agreed to show them what was behind the door. Her hands were shaking as she turned the knob and pushed it open. The smell hit them instantly, the musty odor of old papers and dampness. Mrs. Rodriguez and John stepped in, their eyes widening at the sight before them. The room was filled with boxes, piled one on top of the other. As they began to open them, they found that each box was filled with letters, photographs, and mementos from a bygone era. There were letters from soldiers written during World War II, faded black and white photos of people they didn't recognize, and old trinkets that were probably valuable antiques now. Each box was like a time capsule, preserving a moment in history. Among the pictures, one stood out. A handsome young man in a military uniform, his smile bright, his eyes full of hope and dreams. His picture was framed, a solitary poppy pressed beside it. Eunice pointed to it, her eyes welling up with tears. "That's my Daniel," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My brother." Daniel, Eunice revealed, had been drafted into the war. He was her younger brother, full of life and dreams. But the war had claimed him, as it had so many others. He died a hero, they told her, but that was little consolation. Daniel was not just a name on a war memorial. He was her little brother, her best friend. And he was gone. The scent that Mrs. Rodriguez had detected was Eunice's attempt to keep Daniel's memory alive. Eunice had been collecting artifacts from the war, items that Daniel had touched and had used. She kept them in the room, preserving them, creating an olfactory memory of her brother. She even had his unwashed uniform from all those years back. It even had the horrific spoils of war still on them. Over the years, as the items decayed, the smell became stronger, permeating the apartment. Their discovery was a painful reminder of the brutal reality of war. Each artifact in the room, each memento, was a testament to a life cut short, to dreams unfulfilled, to a sister's undying love. Eunice's secret was not just heartbreaking but a stark reminder of the cost of war. Each trinket was tied to a memory, a story that Eunice had held onto for all these years. Mrs. Rodriguez took Eunice's hand, tears streaming down her own face. "Eunice," she said softly, "you've kept all these memories locked away. You honor your brother, and that is amazing but also sad. Maybe he should not be locked away decaying in a room by himself. I have an idea. Maybe it's time you shared him with the world, Mrs. Rodriguez said. Your home should not be a place to preserve memories that could seriously harm your health. The decaying smell is not good for you. But I understand that you would like to preserve his memory. She then decided to propose something to Mrs. Eunice. And that proposal brought a smile to her face. Eunice smiled through her tears. Perhaps Mrs. Rodriguez was right. Perhaps it was time to let go of the past to share her stories with the world. Perhaps it was time to let someone else into her apartment, her life, her memories. As she looked around the room, Eunice felt a sense of relief. She had been keeping these memories bottled up for far too long. It was time to move forward. In the end, they gave the artifacts to the local museum, a place where professionals stored war memorabilia. Her brother got his own exhibit. Here Eunice could now still honor her brother. A place where he could remain forever and be a true public part of history. Eunice was happy now, and her apartment became a welcoming place for all once again.